From New York, this is Democracy Now!
You got to get your governor to open up your state, okay? Lock them all up.
President Trump calls for the locking up of Michigan's Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer just days after the arrest of 14 men who were part of a right-wing plot to kidnap the governor and take her hostage. New video shows the men had trained in tactical gear, firing assault rifles and tasers. Governor Whitmer accused the president of inspiring terrorists.
The president is at it again and inspiring and incentivizing and inciting this kind of domestic terrorism.
As the presidential campaign enters its final 2 weeks, we'll speak to The Intercept's Jeremy Scahill about American mythology, a new 7-part audio documentary on the Trump years.
There's been this tendency for 4 years to pretend that Donald Trump is some grand aberration of history. And while Trump definitely is a dangerous authoritarian despot in many ways, a lot of his policies are rooted in those of his predecessors. So it's important to set Donald Trump in context of history if we want to prevent this from ever happening again.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. There are now over 40 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 around the world. The U.S. has topped 8.1 million cases, remaining by far the most infected country, with around 20% of known cases globally, both infections and deaths. The U.S. death toll is nearing 220,000. On Friday, the U.S. reported around 70,000 new cases, the highest daily total since July. At least 12 states set single-day case records since Friday. Only 2 states, Vermont and Missouri, reported significant decreases in reported cases over the past week. In an interview with CBS's 60 Minutes, top White House coronavirus task force scientist Anthony Fauci shared his reaction when he saw the Rose Garden ceremony for Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett on TV last month.
Were you surprised that President Trump got sick?
Absolutely not. I was worried that he was going to get sick when I saw him in a completely precarious situation of crowded, no separation between people, and almost nobody wearing a mask. When I saw that on TV, I said, oh my goodness, nothing good can come out of that. That's got to be a problem. And then sure enough, it turned out to be a super spreader event.
At around the same time as Dr. Fauci's interview aired on Sunday, Trump spoke at a campaign rally in Carson City, Nevada, where he mocked Joe Biden, warning there would be more lockdowns if Biden's elected.
If I listened totally to the scientists, we would right now have a country that would be in a massive depression instead of we're like a rocket ship.
In response, the Biden campaign said in a statement Donald Trump tanked the strong economy he inherited by continually discounting and attacking warnings from the scientific and medical experts working around the clock to save lives. Now new coronavirus cases are surging and layoffs are rising. Joe Biden campaigned in the key battleground state of North Carolina this weekend. His running mate, Senator Kamala Harris, is back on the campaign trail and will appear in Orlando and Jacksonville, Florida today. Trump also held rallies in 2 other coronavirus hotspots over the weekend, Michigan and Wisconsin, just as state officials reported record-high COVID-19 cases. Meanwhile, Trump's top coronavirus advisor, Dr. Scott Atlas, known for pushing a herd immunity strategy, tweeted this weekend, quote, "Masks work? No," unquote. Twitter blocked the post for violating a policy on misleading information about COVID-19. A federal judge struck down a Trump rule that would have thrown 700,000 people off food stamps known as SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, amidst the pandemic and record unemployment. In international coronavirus news, Russia hit a new high Friday with over 15,000 new cases. Russia has the fourth highest caseload after the U.S., India, and Brazil. Cases continue to surge across Europe. France enacted a curfew across Paris and 8 other cities. Belgium's closed bars and restaurants nationwide for a month. The British government's given police increased authority to crack down on people who don't self-isolate after getting or being exposed to COVID-19. The foreign ministers of Austria and Belgium have tested positive for COVID-19, raising fears they may have caught it at a meeting last week with other European Union counterparts. Saeb Erekat, the Secretary General of the Palestine Liberation Organization's in critical condition at an Israeli hospital where he's being treated for COVID-19. In Michigan, federal prosecutors have released videos of training exercise carried out by a militia accused by the FBI of plotting to kidnap Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer. The videos show heavily armed men in tactical gear firing assault rifles, working a taser weapon, and talking about taking action against, quote, government thugs. The videos were made public as Governor Whitmer accused President Trump of inciting domestic terrorism during a campaign rally in Muskegon, Michigan, Saturday, where Trump once again assailed Whitmer's response to the coronavirus pandemic and encouraged chants of lock her up.
And get your schools open. Get your schools open. The schools have to be open, right? Lock them all up.
It was Trump's latest attack on Michigan's governor, whom he previously called Gretchen Half Whitmer and, quote, that woman from Michigan. Governor Whitmer fired back Sunday morning on NBC's Meet the Press.
It's incredibly disturbing that the President of the United States, 10 days after a plot to kidnap, put me on trial and execute me, 10 days after that was uncovered, the president is at it again and inspiring and incentivizing and inciting this kind of domestic terrorism.
Last Thursday, police arrested 51-year-old Wisconsin resident Brian Higgins on charges he used night vision goggles and a dash cam to surveil Governor Whitmer's vacation home. He was the 14th person arrested in the alleged plot to kidnap Whitmer. In Utah, federal prosecutors have indicted 21 self-avowed white supremacists on drug and weapons charges. Their arrest came days after 24 alleged white supremacist prison gang members in Kentucky, Mississippi, and Texas were indicted on charges of racketeering, illegal firearms trafficking, and murder. Separately, the FBI arrested a known white supremacist Thursday and charged him with plotting to firebomb a synagogue in Pueblo, Colorado. The indictments come just weeks after FBI Director Christopher Wray warned Congress racially motivated violent extremism is the primary threat of domestic terrorism in the United States. The United Nations is calling on Armenia and Azerbaijan to respect a Russian-brokered ceasefire after both sides accused each other of violating the truce with indiscriminate attacks that killed civilians. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres pointed to an attack Saturday in Azerbaijan's second-largest city, Ganja, which killed 13 people, including children. Armenia said Azeri forces fired missiles on civilians in Nagorno-Karabakh's capital city. Kyrgyzstan's parliament has installed a new interim president following protests over a disputed parliamentary election that toppled much of the government earlier this month. Until last week, Sadar Japarov was serving an 11-year prison term on kidnapping charges he says were trumped up. He'll now serve as president and prime minister of Kyrgyzstan at the same time, the first time the Central Asian nation has had one person in both roles. A new presidential election is tentatively scheduled for January. Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny is calling out President Trump over his refusal to condemn Russian President Vladimir Putin for allegedly using banned chemical weapons on political opponents. Navalny became violently ill on an airplane in August, but survived the ordeal. German scientists have said he was poisoned with the nerve agent Novichok. He spoke with CBS's 60 Minutes from Berlin, where he's recovering.
I think it's extremely important that everyone, of course, including and maybe in the first row, President of the United States, to be very against using chemical weapon in the 21st century.
In Afghanistan, at least 12 civilians were killed, over 100 injured, after a car bomb exploded outside a police headquarters in the central Ghor province. Fighting between Taliban and Afghan government forces have displaced tens of thousands of Afghans in recent days, with the U.S. also launching airstrikes in Helmand province. This comes as intra-Afghan peace talks, which started over a month ago in Doha, appear to be stalling. In Thailand, tens of thousands again took to the streets for protests Saturday in defiance of a ban on large gatherings and a police crackdown on demonstrations. On Friday, riot police deployed water cannons laced with a chemical irritant as the youth-led crowds continue to call for democratic reforms and the resignation of the prime minister. Rights groups also condemned the arrest of protesters and a journalist on Friday. In Bolivia, former President Evo Morales' political party, MAS, is claiming victory in Sunday's presidential election. Exit polls show Luis Arce has won over half of the vote, giving him an outright win. If confirmed, it will put the Socialist Party back in power, putting an end to the far-right government, which ousted Evo Morales in November 2019 and is currently led by Janine Áñez. Protests have rocked Bolivia for months now, calling out the government's use of military and police repression and violence against indigenous communities. In Chile, tens of thousands of people took to the streets of Santiago Sunday to mark the first anniversary of mass protests against neoliberal policies and inequality in Chile. The police clashed with protesters and fired tear gas and water cannons. Chile is preparing to vote on a referendum that could replace the country's Pinochet-era constitution next Sunday. This is one of the protesters.
There's a lot of injustice in Chile. We have to keep fighting. That is all. We haven't achieved anything yet. A year has passed and nothing has been achieved. That's why we have to keep fighting in the streets.
Meanwhile, in Lebanon, hundreds of people marched in Beirut this weekend to mark the 1 year of anti-government protests. Mexico's former defense secretary, General Salvador Cienfuegos, has been indicted in New York on charges of money laundering and conspiracy to distribute drugs in the U.S. from 2015 to 2017. Cienfuegos is accused of working with the Beltran-Leyva cartel to arrest torture rivals in exchange for bribes. Cienfuegos has also long been accused of human rights abuses in Mexico, including refusing to allow investigators to interview soldiers who may have been involved in the 2014 disappearance and likely massacre of 43 students from a teacher's college in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero. General Cienfuegos also defended soldiers who were accused of massacring nearly 24 people in the town of Tlatlaya in the state of Mexico in 2014. Cienfuegos was arrested at Los Angeles International Airport. He served as defense secretary from 2012 to 2018 under Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. In Pakistan, tens of thousands of protesters rallied in Karachi on Sunday, seeking the ouster of Prime Minister Imran Khan, who they say was installed by the military after a rigged election 2 years ago. The demonstration was organized by a coalition of opposition groups who accused the Khan government of mishandling Pakistan's economy, as well as cracking down on dissent and the media. A United Nations-imposed arms embargo against Iran expired Sunday, clearing the way for countries like Russia and China to sell conventional weapons to Iran, including tanks, helicopters, and missiles. The embargo's expiration came over the objections of the Trump administration, which imposed harsh economic sanctions on Iran in 2018 after it unilaterally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. In New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has won a second term with her Labour Party expected to receive an outright majority in Parliament. Ardern has been widely lauded for her response to New Zealand's coronavirus outbreak. There's currently no community spread in New Zealand, and masks and social distancing are no longer required. Back in the United States, thousands took part in a number of women's marches across the country Saturday in a call to vote out President Trump and oppose the nomination and likely confirmation of conservative Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Here in New York, another rally under the banner State of Emergency took place in Manhattan as the families of Breonna Taylor and Jacob Blake joined activists and called on people to vote in the election. This is activist and organizer Tamika Mallory.
There is no debate about what has to be done in these next couple of weeks. The last thing is that the election does not begin on November 3rd. It ends on November 3rd. You need to be getting ready to vote right now.
In Colorado, the Cameron Peak Fire has become the largest wildfire in the state's history, burning over 200,000 acres. The Calwood Fire, which broke out Saturday, has forced over 3,000 people to evacuate Boulder County. The state of Colorado is experiencing drought conditions, with around 60% of Colorado in extreme drought conditions or worse. Meanwhile, Trump reversed course on Friday and approved relief funds for the devastating climate change-fueled wildfires in California, which is going through its worst fire season ever recorded. The federal funds had been refused just hours earlier. Over 4 million acres have burned so far in 2020, more than double California's previous record. And the Supreme Court Friday agreed to expedite the case over Trump's attempt to exclude undocumented residents from the census count. The justices will hear arguments on November 30th, 1 month before the Census Bureau submits the data, which will determine the allocation of congressional seats around the country. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, as the presidential campaign enters its final 2 weeks, we'll speak with The Intercept's Jeremy Scahill about his new 7-part audio documentary series on the last 4 years. It's called American Mythology. Stay with us.
Well, the whole wide world, it is exploding, violence is flaring, and the bullets are loading. If there ever was a time, you better start voting. You don't believe in war, but what is that gun you're toting? And even the Rio Grande has the bodies are floating. But you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, I don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. Don't you understand what I'm trying to say? Can't you feel the fears that I'm feeling today? You send your kids to school and you feel that they're safe. Then you get the call that the shooter went mad in the place. Take a look around you, boy. It's bound to scare you, boy. And then you tell me over and over and over again.
Eve of Destruction by Casey Abrams. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump campaigned in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada over the weekend as he scrambles to pick up more support in critical swing states in these last 2 closing weeks of the 2020 race. Speaking in Muskegon, Michigan Saturday, President Trump demanded Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer reopen the state. The crowd soon started chanting, "Lock her up." Trump responded by saying, "Lock them all up."
You got to get your governor to open up your state, okay? And get your schools open. Get your schools open. The schools have to be open, right? Lock them all up.
Trump Trump's remarks came just less than 2 weeks after the FBI and authorities in Michigan arrested 13 men with ties to armed right-wing groups, including 6 men who allegedly plotted to kidnap Michigan Governor Whitmer and take her hostage. A 7th man was arrested in connection with the kidnapping plot and charged on Thursday with suspicion of material support in an act of terrorism. Over the weekend, federal prosecutors released videos of training exercises carried out by the men accused of plotting to kidnap Whitmer. The videos show heavily armed men in tactical gear firing assault rifles and taser weapons. In one video, one of the arrested men talks about killing, quote, government thugs.
If this whole thing, starts to happen, I'm telling you what, dude, I'm taking out as many of those motherfuckers as I can. Every single one, dude. Every single one.
On Sunday, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer appeared on Meet the Press and criticized President Trump.
It's incredibly disturbing that the President of the United States, 10 days after a plot to kidnap, put me on trial, and execute me, 10 days after that was uncovered, the president is at it again and inspiring and incentivizing and inciting this kind of domestic terrorism. It is wrong. It's got to end. It is dangerous, not just for me and my family, but for public servants everywhere who are doing their jobs and trying to protect their fellow Americans.
FBI Director Christopher Wray recently warned Congress that racially motivated violent extremism is the primary threat of domestic terrorism. President Trump's call to lock them all up is part of a pattern where he openly calls for the arrests of his political opponents and critics, including Democratic presidential nominee, former President Obama, who's going on the road to campaign for Biden on Wednesday, and 2016 presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. As the presidential campaign enters its final 2 weeks, we're spending the hour looking at these recent developments in the past 4 years of the Trump's presidency, from his crackdown on immigration to his use of racialized fear-mongering and incitement to run the country. We're joined by investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept. His podcast, Intercepted, just released the 4th chapter in a 7-part audio documentary series titled American Mythology: The Presidency of Donald Trump. Jeremy Scahill is the author of several books, including Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, and Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, and also the name of his film. Jeremy, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. We want to talk about a number of the issues you're covering in this really comprehensive documentary series you're doing, looking at the past 4 years. But let's start with what happened this weekend. Let's start with, once again, President Trump, this time not saying liberate Michigan, but joining in a chant as the people around him call lock her up, talking about Governor Whitmer, who is just the target of a plot to be kidnapped and perhaps lynched, brought to Wisconsin, where you grew up, to be tried. Respond to what's taking place right now.
Amy, I think that what's become very, very clear over these 4 years is that Donald Trump is not an aberration of U.S. history or some anomaly, but he is a very overt representation of many of the absolute most violent, destructive, racist, xenophobic trends in U.S. history. We can talk about the way that he has empowered white nationalists, white supremacists, encouraged their violence. But I think that it's important to set that in a broader context of Trump being essentially a Trojan horse for the most extreme policies of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is one of the most dangerous political bodies on the face of the earth today. And so while it is important to focus on the activities of individual militias, the plot against Governor Whitmer, the use of vehicles to try to murder protesters, we can't do it at the expense of recognizing that these are sort of the unofficial shock troops of what is a long-term Republican agenda that has at its center white supremacy, anti-worker policies, anti-women policies, and certainly with Mike Pence in the White House, a right-wing Christian supremacist theocratic ideology that's manifesting itself right now in the court system. So what we're seeing is Trump using a tactic that was used against black people in this country for centuries, where you have these unofficial forces that are doing the lynching, and then those in power are saying, oh, well, we didn't do that. We're going to rustle up those good old boys and put them on trial, if they would even do that. The reality is that there is this nexus where between the white supremacist unofficial forces, the shock troops of this administration, and then Trump cultivating so-called law enforcement as a political class and sort of appealing to the police nationwide to also come out front and center as his racialized shock troops. So all of this can be traced to the through lines of white supremacist politics in official Washington, as well as the broader racist, xenophobic culture in the United States. That's what we're seeing right now, is a manifestation of what Donald Trump has now made clear, that these strands of American history are alive, well, and very, very deadly.
Last week, President Trump appeared to admit that he ordered U.S. Marshals to carry out the extrajudicial killing of the anti-fascist activist Michael Reinl in Washington State on September 3rd. He'd been accused of killing a far-right activist during a protest in Portland. This is Trump.
We sent in the U.S. Marshals. Took 15 minutes, it was over. 15 minutes, it was over. We got him. They knew who he was. They didn't want to arrest him. And 15 minutes, that ended.
Can you respond to this, Jeremy?
Look, there's a word for what it appears happened there, and that's assassination. And it appears to be certainly the way that Trump is bragging about it. Now, we don't have all of the details, but Donald Trump is speaking about this as a political assassination of an American citizen on U.S. soil. And it appears that they have lied, or at least dramatically misled the public into believing that there was some, epic shootout that took place. It sounds, based on the president's own description, that this was an assassination. And I think as we all watch in horror at the kidnappings that have taken place of protesters, at the murder of unarmed black people in this country, at the ramming with vehicles of police, that again, we are a nation that has long assassinated its own people when they become politically inconvenient, or when we consider them to be less than humans getting too uppity. I recall the the assassination of Black Panther Party leader Fred Hampton in Chicago. We've had civil rights leaders and presidential candidates assassinated. We've had a president assassinated in this country. And I think that this tendency to sort of act as though Trump has crossed the Rubicon is ahistorical. Trump represents a dark part of American history that we have never fully reckoned with. And we have both parties in this country have continued to empower Donald Trump. The Democrats, for all of their constant harping on Trump being the worst president in history, this great threat to democracy as we know it and the future of the republic, should be asked, why have you consistently voted to give this dangerous tyrant, as you characterize him, sweeping surveillance powers, the ability to spy on American citizens? You think that these votes that the Democrats are backing in the Congress that have to do with surveillance and paramilitarization of law enforcement, that these are somehow disconnected from the fact that we now have a president openly celebrating the assassination of an American citizen on U.S. soil? The powers of the executive branch have been so radically broadened, beginning really in the Ford administration, but particularly after 9/11. And when we had a constitutional law professor as president for 8 years, instead of moving to radically rein in the powers of the presidency, what we saw was Obama utilize them himself. Now, Obama wasn't running around whacking U.S. citizens on American soil, but he did assassinate citizens overseas, including a 16-year-old American citizen who was never accused of any crime of terrorism, who Obama had killed in a drone strike. So You know, the dangers of Donald Trump, I'm not trying to minimize anything about Donald Trump. I think this is a dangerous, dangerous despot. But if we refuse to recognize how we got Donald Trump and the historical context of what he's doing as president, and that it is rooted in American history, if we don't reckon with that, then voting Donald Trump out of office is just one step. We still have this rotten system that can be exploited by another Trump, or even by a Democrat who claims to be hoping and changing left and right.
Jeremy, back on the issue of the white supremacists, the Michigan Attorney General also warned when people talked about them being kind of like Keystone Cops-esque, and we see the video of them practicing shooting, tasering, the terrifying idea that they would not stop at kidnapping her, but as they had promised in the past, lynching her. The Michigan Attorney General said this is just the tip of the iceberg. You have President Trump's own FBI, even if Christopher Wray is not exactly his ally, and the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, coming out with this report saying that white supremacist violent extremists are the #1 domestic terrorist threat in this country, far more than international threats to the United States are white supremacist right-wing extremists.
You know, I mean, and clearly the Trump administration, if they've even looked at that information, have taken that and said, OK, this is a good thing. Let's continue to encourage them. Donald Trump is doing what authoritarians throughout history have done when they're asked to condemn the violence of unofficial forces. They will grudgingly do that while at the same time saying things like, you know, stand down and stand by. In other words, you know, wait and see. But I really want to emphasize that you cannot separate these white supremacist militias, alleged plots to kidnap Democratic governors in this country from the fact that Trump has cultivated law enforcement as a political class, and he has openly and repeatedly encouraged them to act extrajudicially, to beat people harder, to not respect their rights. Trump threatened to send in the U.S. military at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests. Trump encouraged mayors and governors to beat them harder in the streets. We have a paramilitarized state of law enforcement in this country that also often acts as a white supremacist gang, particularly when facing down African Americans or brown people or people of color. You know, that is something that I fear that if we focus too much on the threat of white supremacist private actors at the expense of recognizing how the taxpayer-funded official forces also serve that same function, and with the full backing of the White House, that we're sort of being misdirected here. This is a systemic problem, and the Proud Boys of the world and the Ku Klux Klans of the world and the militias of the world, they essentially are auxiliary forces for official government forces that often function as effective white supremacist militias, particularly in black communities.
And then you have, for example, Kenosha, where they come together, where you have these white vigilantes come in saying they are protecting private property, and the authorities there, the law enforcement authorities, are supporting them. And then you have Kyle Rittenhouse giving them water, saying we support you here. And then you have this 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse who opened fires and kills 2 Black Lives Matter activists. President Trump defends him. Yeah, and he is not killed by federal authorities, as we saw happen in Oregon.
No, and in fact, at these Black Lives Matter protests, when these vile so-called counter-protesters show up, you know, we've seen people try fire bow and arrow, you know, arrows from crossbows at protesters. We've seen the use of vehicles as a lethal or semi-lethal weapon against protesters. More than 100 cases of individuals using their cars. And I believe at last count, 8 of them were police officers that actually had used vehicles to ram into protesters. But Donald Trump on a domestic level is saying that someone like Kyle Rittenhouse is sort of, he's misunderstood and he's essentially on the right side of history. And he does the same thing abroad. Trump has pardoned outright war criminals who have committed massacres against civilians abroad. And at home, he has, at his rallies, offered to pay the legal fees of people that beat up protesters. He's encouraged the police to act with more brutality. He's consistently staked out a position that says that if you kill in the name of protecting the real America, white America, then we're going to be there for you. We've got your back. And that's a very, very frightening, overt manifestation of a white supremacy that's at the core of this country that has never been fully addressed. And it's why we're seeing someone like Trump able to pull this off. We do not have a true opposition in the form of the Democratic Party on a legislative level. Quite the contrary, they've consistently supported some of Trump's most dangerous tools available to the executive branch.
Which takes us from racism to xenophobia, part 2 of your audio documentary series, American Mythology, called Administration of Xenophobia. This clip begins with you, Jeremy Scahill.
From the beginning, Trump's approach to upending immigration in the country has been met with legal challenges, including on DACA and family separation. And while those challenges wind their way through the courts, the Trump administration has also developed a sophisticated strategy of implementing interlocking changes that will be difficult to undo. Recent analysis from the Migration Policy Institute finds that the administration has adopted more than 400 changes to immigration rules and regulations. Journalist Juan Gonzalez has written several books dealing with the history of U.S. immigration policy.
The fascist trend represented by Trump wants to totally reverse immigration policy. To, instead of saying, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, give me your best educated people who have the most money, who can essentially buy their way into the United States.
That's Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in Jeremy Scahill's series, American Mythology. Jeremy, take it from there. The Trump administration has succeeded in essentially ending asylum in America.
Yeah, and virtually shut down the southern border for all practical purposes. And what I think is important to remember is that Trump also, as we just heard, his administration has tinkered with more than 400 different aspects of immigration policy, and in the sort of most overt or tangible way, you're citing the rules on asylum, but also making it much more difficult, much more expensive, just for run-of-the-mill normal immigration procedures. And what we've seen is this sort of methodical, surgical operation to go through and make life as miserable and difficult as possible for current immigrants who are already here, but also prospective immigrants, including children who are fleeing legitimate violence. And by the way, we should mention that many of the countries in Central America where people are fleeing from, the violence in those countries is largely a product of U.S. dirty wars that were waged throughout the 80s and 90s, and the U.S. support for death squads and civil wars and dictators. And that's almost never discussed when we talk about the broader so-called crackdown on immigration. But all of this is the architecture of one of the most vile people to serve in government in modern times, and that is Trump's senior advisor, Stephen Miller. This was a kind of pathetic, angry white guy in college who felt that the black people and the immigrants were all ruining his opportunities in the world. And you sort of unleash this unstable, nasty, angry, hateful man with the levers of power to write immigration policy. And what we're seeing is this very overt racism. And I would link this, Amy, also to the way that Donald Trump talks about Ilhan Omar, the Democratic congresswoman from Minneapolis, who herself was a refugee from Somalia. Trump has used, on the one hand, Chicago as a placeholder to attack Black America as sort of violent people who need to be put in their place. And he uses Ilhan Omar to attack immigrants writ large, but specifically to say, Black immigrants are the problem. These people from Somalia, they don't even have a government where she's from. And then she comes here. Ilhan Omar is a U.S. citizen. Ilhan Omar was a refugee who fled a country where, many people probably have seen the film Black Hawk Down. The United States was deeply involved with the horrid destabilization of the country that she fled. And her story is a classic American one. She left a violent place where she didn't have freedom and came to the United States seeking a better life, mobilized and organized herself, and became a member of the United States House of Representatives, democratically elected. So, when you look at the broader immigration picture in this country, on the one hand, there's the policy. On the other hand, this is a classic authoritarian tactic to tell the quote unquote real citizens of the country that the problem is the dirty, filthy vermin that come in the form of the outsider. And that's what Trump is doing. And it's what despots have done throughout history. But Trump is only the front man for this, Amy. Bipartisan Democratic Republican immigration policy for decades has targeted immigrants in a merciless way. Bill Clinton started this business with expanding the border wall and building fences and propping up paramilitary law enforcement. George Bush doubled down on it. Barack Obama also he earned the moniker the deporter in chief from immigrant rights activists because he deported record numbers of people. 3 million people were deported under Barack Obama. And, the Democrats are running Joe Biden as a candidate, and Joe Biden represents some of the absolute most right-wing aspects of the history of the modern Democratic Party, including on immigration. Now, he's saying that he's shifting some of that, and I do think there are very, very clear, tangible ways that Joe Biden would take away some of the imminent threat to immigrants. But let's not pretend that Donald Trump just popped up and all of a sudden we have a racist immigration policy. This country has had a racist immigration policy for a very long time, and it's bipartisan, with the Republicans being much more vicious, but it's been bipartisan.
And as you look back over these last 4 years, let's not forget the word he used as he talked about, and I won't say the word, but S-hole countries that include African countries as well as Haiti in Trump's book. And in a notification sent by Trump administration to Congress late last month, the administration proposed denying most refugees from Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. And just this past weekend, in the last days, the Trump administration put out a press release saying they had arrested 170, quote, aliens. Of course, we don't use that word. Said they arrested 170 people targeting sanctuary cities. Jeremy Scahill, we have to break. When we come back, we want to look at your the American mythology documentary that you dropped today, that you released today on war. Stay with us.
Now take what you need. You think it'll last, but whatever you used to kill, and bear them very fast. Your distance, your orphan, where it's gone, crying like a fire in the sun. Look at all the signs are coming through. It's all over now, baby.
It's all over now, Baby Blue by Anoni. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're spending the hour with Intercept co-founder Jeremy Scahill. His podcast, Intercepted, has just released the 4th chapter in a 7-part audio documentary series titled American Mythology, the Presidency of Donald Trump. This latest installment focuses on war and looks at how Donald Trump ran for president in 2016 with a mixed message of attacking the legacy of the Iraq War and U.S. military adventurism while simultaneously pledging to commit war crimes and promote imperialism. This is Trump denouncing the Iraq War and used it to attack his Republican opponents during a presidential debate in the lead-up to the 2016 election.
Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right? Now, you can take it any way you want, and it took Jeb Bush, if you remember at the beginning of his announcement, when he announced for president, it took him 5 days. He went back. It was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It took him 5 days before his people told him what to say, and he ultimately said it was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
In that case, he was debating, among others, Jeb Bush, President George W. Bush's brother. But even as he attacked the Iraq War, Donald Trump repeatedly said the U.S. should kill the families of terrorists. This is what he said during a 2015 interview on Fox News.
One of the problems that we have, and one of the reasons we're so ineffective, is, they're using them as shields. It's a horrible thing. They're using them as shields. But we're fighting a very politically correct war.
Yeah. Well, we see that happening in
the other thing is with the terrorists, you have to take out their families. When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their families. They care about their lives. Don't kid yourself. But they say they don't care about their lives. You have to take out their families.
So by April 2017, just 3 months into his presidency, Trump launched a Tomahawk missile attack on Syria in retaliation for an alleged chemical weapons attack on civilians. Jeremy, you say in your series, like Pavlov's dogs, the bipartisan war machine responded accordingly. Let's go to some of the media coverage of Trump's attack on Syria. And this is MSNBC anchor Brian Williams referring to a Pentagon video of U.S. missiles fired at Syria as beautiful 3 times in 30 seconds.
Go into greater detail. We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these 2 U.S. Navy vessels in the eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield. What did they hit?
That was MSNBC's Brian Williams, and this is CNN's Fareed Zakaria.
I think Donald Trump became president of the United States. I think this was actually a big moment because candidate Trump had said that he would never get involved in the Syrian civil war. He told President Obama, you cannot do this without the authorization of Congress. He seemed unconcerned with global norms. President Trump recognized that the President of the United States does have to act to enforce international norms, does have to have this broader moral and political purpose.
So that is CNN's Fareed Zakaria. From Trump became president that night to the beauty of the weapons, the bombs falling on Syria. Jeremy Scahill.
Well, Amy, I'll just point to at the end of 2019, you had more than 180 House Democrats vote for a record-shattering military budget for Donald Trump. Only 40-something Democrats opposed it, and that record-shattering, more than $22 billion greater than any Obama era military budget, was a bipartisan product. Nothing brings the Democrats and the Republicans together more than a cruise missile strike or policy on U.S. policy on Israel. And so on foreign policy, the most sort of intense attacks when it comes to war or national security on Donald Trump from the Democrats have come when he's tried to move away from war. When Trump was trying to actually end the Korean War, and yes, he was doing it in an insane way, and I don't co-sign any of Trump's rhetoric, but wouldn't it be, as Alan Nairn points out in our documentary, wouldn't it be a great thing for the Korean people if the Korean War ended? And yet you had Democrats goading Trump and essentially trying to push him into doing something really insane. On the one hand, Trump wanted to broker this deal with Kim Jong-un and North Korea. On the other hand, he would threaten to wipe North Korea off the map entirely. And the Democrats repeatedly played with fire, particularly when Trump said, let's get out of these foreign wars. Donald Trump, by all indications, it seems like one of the reasons why John Bolton was ousted as the national security advisor was because he was too belligerent even for Donald Trump. And Trump said that if he hadn't gotten rid of John Bolton, that we would be in World War VI by now. But Amy, I think it's important to sort of back up and look at this in the bigger picture. Donald Trump is the kind of guy who says we need to murder the families of terrorists. Barack Obama actually did kill family members of suspected terrorists, including American citizens who were children. They repeatedly double tap drone strike where they would bomb funerals. They hit weddings. So, yes, it's shocking to hear an American president say the things that Donald Trump says. But let's not pretend here like the Democrats are doves. Bill Clinton initiated the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam in Iraq, bombing Iraq on average once every 3 days at times. Barack Obama engaged in regime change, deadly economic sanctions, dramatically expanded drone strike operations, surged troops around the world. I sort of, in really carefully analyzing Donald Trump's war policy, I would say that he thus far has proven less murderous than George W. Bush and more of a war criminal than Jimmy Carter.
So explain what this portends for the future, what you feel a possible Biden win could mean, and what would it mean if Trump remains as president.
When it comes to sort of the current and ongoing wars, Joe Biden, what we know about his time as vice president and as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Biden and Trump actually have some similar ideas about how U.S. war should be waged. Joe Biden was reportedly against the troop surge that Obama did early on in his presidency, and Biden favored using CIA operators and special forces teams to do so-called targeted strikes, the kind of anti-terrorist operations where you're going in and taking out high-value targets, or you're working with local forces on the ground, but with special operations forces going in and then getting out. So I would say that there are some overlaps between the way that Trump has approached his Afghanistan strategy, for instance, which has been to essentially pull out conventional forces and escalate the mass murder, escalate the killing. Joe Biden, though, is much more of a kind of globally oriented neoliberal who is a major fan of using very, very brutal economic sanctions mixed with covert operations. Joe Biden is a very hawkish political figure. And I think he and Donald Trump on a foreign policy level, when it comes to war strategy, tactics, I think they have much more in common than the press will let on. Donald Trump has not been an exceptional president when it comes to war policy. Almost every single act that people have sort of gasped, oh my God, Trump did that. You can point to historical analogs. He assassinates General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad in an airstrike. Multiple U.S. presidents have attempted to assassinate foreign leaders. Bill Clinton repeatedly struck presidential palaces in Iraq. Ronald Reagan attempted to kill Muammar Gaddafi, and on and on. You can go back through history, through the coups and CIA. So, the reason that I bring all of this up is that my great fear is if we defeat Donald Trump and he's no longer the president, and we pretend that all of these bad things happened as a result of Donald Trump, then we really haven't moved forward. Yes, we've staunched the bleeding. This is a horrifying administration. But unless we're willing to take on the fact that our electoral system is bought and paid for by corporations, that the United States is constantly ceding its politics to despotic regimes like Saudi Arabia, unquestioning support of Israel, the belief that we have the right to kill anyone, anywhere on the flimsiest of justifications. If we pretend that it was just lawlessness began with Donald Trump, it's sort of like when Obama said we need to look forward, not backward, and refused to hold any CIA torturers accountable. It's the #1 way to ensure that torture will happen again. It's the #1 way to ensure that U.S. militarism and the killing of civilians will continue if you don't recognize the root of the problem. Donald Trump is not the root of the problem. Donald Trump is a product of American imperial history.
You talk about the number of people who have died. There's a different kind of battleground now in the United States and around the world, and it's an ICU. It's a hospital bed. It is right now, something like close to 220,000 people in the United States, a fifth of the death toll of coronavirus in the world right here in the most powerful country on earth, and a fifth of the infections at something like 8 million when we surpass the 40 million mark for infections around the world. Jeremy, your parents are both nurses in Wisconsin, a crucial swing state that's recorded its highest number of new coronavirus cases on Friday. According to an internal government report, many of Wisconsin's 72 counties are now considered sustained COVID-19 hotspots. On Saturday, Trump rallied in Janesville, Wisconsin, said it was time to open up the state for business as usual. Your response to what Trump has done around the coronavirus with his hand-picked advisor, coronavirus advisor, Dr. Scott Atlas, he has pushed aside Dr. Fauci, tweeting this weekend, which Twitter deleted, masks, no.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how else to describe what Trump has done except homicidal. And it could be even on a literal level with Donald Trump having, he said he was diagnosed with coronavirus. He was at Walter Reed. Now he's, running around, claims he's not infectious. I mean, how do we know? How do we know when Donald Trump's last actual negative test was? And has he just been running around spreading this? I mean, is the president of the United States, we talk about presidents being murderers on a policy level, but this president may actually be killing people. And I think that is really a metaphor for how this entire thing has unfolded. Trump believes that as long as he and his people have the good medical care and that they can weather this, it doesn't really matter who dies, because at the end of the day, the point is to stick it to the Democrats and maintain power. And this is also a very racist response. If this was if this was just wiping out the kind of Trump family or his inner circle instead of disproportionately affecting black and brown and poor people in this country, I think we would see even a greater level of outrage at this administration. My mom has a very serious lung condition. She, I think rightly, blames President Trump because she can't set foot outside of her house. She can't see her grandchildren. And I think that's a big motivating factor for people, particularly older people who are now increasingly saying that they support Joe Biden, is that they recognize that it didn't have to be this way. And to me, it's really an indication of the kind of presidency that this has been. It's all been one huge grift. It's all been one huge scam. And I think that perhaps the most long-term danger, the short-term crisis is unconscionable, the number of people that have been killed and made sick because of incompetence. But on a long-term level, if Joe Biden wins and becomes president and we don't reckon with how we got here, with how Donald Trump was created, nurtured in this system and able to seize power, then I really fear for the future of this country, because this is the tip of the iceberg. Seeing someone like Trump take power and bring all of this to the fore, I think if we don't reckon with history, we're in deep, deep trouble as a country, no matter what happens during these elections.
You talked about Black Lives Matter, the movements of immigration rights. I wanted to end with the Catholic workers, the Catholic peace activists in Georgia. Catholic peace activist Patrick O'Neill sentenced to 14 months in jail Friday for breaking into the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in Georgia to protest nuclear weapons policy. He's part of the Kings Bay Plowshare 7 group of Catholic peace activists who entered the base on the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. Can you talk about the significance of this in the last 20 seconds we have?
I've said for a long time the greatest danger that the world has faced from Donald Trump is the possible threat of a first-strike nuclear weapon that happens as a result of some tweet that Trump doesn't like from a foreign leader. These Catholic peace activists during the Trump administration tried to confront that nuclear threat and there was a total media blackout on the action that they did. And, you know, if we lived in a just society, the Kings Bay Plowshares activist trial would have been reported on as one of the most brave confrontations of the most dangerous aspect of this government and particularly this administration.
We have to leave it there. Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of The Intercept, will link to your American Mythology series podcast, Intercepted. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.